good you're all here. My name is Richard Long. I'm with MHA Consulting, and hopefully we're going to talk a little bit about being prepared in our business continuity and disaster recovery programs and planning. So that's what we're here to do. Again, if you have any questions, please just jump right in. Raise your hand, throw out a chat, whatever that is. So I have been with MHA for about the last 12 years. MHA has been in operation for the last 20. If you don't know who we are, we really focus on the business continuity, disaster recovery areas. We've all been around. Our consultants tend to be experienced. We've been doing this for 20 plus years. A lot of us, really started out either on the technical side or in the business continuity realm, and have worked their way up. I myself am a IT person by training, and have had various roles from individual contributor, system administrator, application integration, and then up through management levels. We really try to work with our clients and customize solutions for them, and make sure that what works is most appropriate, as opposed to having a single kind of solution or methodology. And then we do have some tools as well. We do some BIA, SaaS tools, BIA, a BCM1, which is really a place to keep your documentation, and then a compliance, competence, and residual risk that helps within the risk assessment and determination of your program maturity. So we're not going to talk about that, but that's, you can always check our website out for those kind of things. This is just a quick view of our customer and client base. You can see we go across multiple verticals, across the healthcare and insurance, consumer, travel, government, utilities. So I think we've got a good broad experience. We've seen a lot of different things that we then try to apply to our clients and leverage what we've seen there. So it helps us, and I think it helps give some perspective on top of not only seeing from a vertical perspective, but also seeing from a different size. You can see there's multiple sizes of organizations here, and some of them have global presence. Some of them are very large in maybe some more rural areas versus in the cities, and so it really does help. And we've been very blessed, and we appreciate those clients who have allowed us to work with them. In everything that we do, we really want to make sure that we take in this balance between risk, maturity, compliance, and readiness, right? So our resilience is really making sure that balance. We don't necessarily think that we need to be one side or the other. And so obviously the perfect is where it's in balance, and specifically related to the type of risk that organizations look at. So the things that we'll talk about today are related to that. We're going to be talking about kind of the readiness and the compliance side of things. But that's really our view. We don't necessarily want to under-report risk or under-prepare because something will never happen. It's really based on the organization's risk and their ability to tolerate risk. And then also we don't want to necessarily overdo on the preparedness. There's sometimes that the simple solution is appropriate, or it might be appropriate just to accept the risk because the dollars or the impact might be small enough or low enough that it just doesn't make sense to spend the effort. So the concept of today's discussion and presentation was kind of a blog that we did several weeks ago, a few months ago, and it's really kind of that idea of missing some small details can potentially have a potential major impact if you actually have to recover. So we really want to look at being detailed and making sure that the small things are appropriately reviewed and included in your execution and in your planning. And it's that old proverb, right, of about a nail. So without the nail, the shoe, and then because of the shoe, the horse was lost, and because of the horse, the rider, the message, the battle, and then because that battle was lost, ultimately the kingdom was lost. And so we can see those relationships, and sometimes from a business continuity perspective, we can get caught up in kind of the bigger strategies and the audit areas and those things that are very important. But when we get down to it, some of those minutiae can cause issues when we're actually trying to recover. And we see that a lot, both in our tabletop exercises and even in our DR exercises. And I've got a couple of examples to start with. Are there any questions or anything to this point? Or given that, it's a small group, are there any specific questions that you want to make sure are addressed, or issues that you'd like to make sure we kind of customize for you? Because I'm very, very much happy to do that. All right. Well, if there is, please jump right in. We'd like to just always kind of remind folks about this kind of overall crisis spectrum as it relates to what really is likely to happen. And the one that I'm most interested in is really the one on the right-hand side of the screen, which is the smoldering versus sudden. We tend to really plan for sudden type of crises, natural events, major type of technology outage that we weren't expecting, when in reality, the majority of crises that do happen tend to be something that's been going on, it's been kind of sitting there smoldering, and then it raises itself up. So I think that's something to be important as we think about our planning and the details that we do is, are we really looking at those things that we've all kind of known about, and when an event happens, we look at it and say, yeah, we knew that we weren't doing a real good job on a certain maintenance of technology, but we just hoped it would never happen. Or kind of the same thing from a business continuity perspective. Yeah, we knew the plan was always a little bit weak there, but we assumed we'd never need it, so we really didn't worry about it. That's, I think, kind of situation that we're talking about here. So just as a kind of a reminder of the things that as we're thinking about our planning and the execution that we do, right? There's these types of risks or occurrences that happen, right? Human error. And that's something that we're never going to be able to resolve. And anybody that thinks we will get rid of human error just is probably not who we want to be thinking about these plans. Because it's going to happen. That's just the beauty of being human. We're going to make errors. Then there's the intentional and unintentional, right? The intentional may not be malicious, but it's taking shortcuts, not following procedures, right? Not following change control, not reviewing the plans, not making sure that the workarounds that are documented are updated, just knowing that we're not doing it. And then the unintentional is just a mistake, right? We didn't think it would occur, or a person just didn't know, right? There's a lack of knowledge or understanding, right? You make a wrong decision based on the information that you have, and it turned out to be a wrong decision. That's going to happen, but it's unintentional. It's not expected, as opposed to either maliciously trying to do something or just deciding it's not important, so I'm not going to follow the process. And then one of the big things going on today, really data breaches, ransomware, and those kind of cybersecurity issues. Brand and reputational image, I think we're seeing a lot more of those in the world today, especially as social media just gets more and more and more, and that news cycle is immediate, that people are out there. And you can actually, the whole fake news, however you fall on, kind of from a political perspective, it's not a political statement, but just that idea of anybody can throw something out and all of a sudden it sticks, whether it's true or not. And so that can happen. And then obviously we've got technology types of issues as well. And we're seeing that more and more and more. Going up again back to human error, not following processes is typically where those occur. So as we're looking at our details and we think about this, just a quick reminder of the importance of certain areas. And I think everybody understands this, but sometimes, when we're getting into a crisis or we're doing our planning, we jump immediately to restoration of the business, not necessarily thinking in terms of what do we need to do from a life safety and a stabilization perspective, or even in terms of property or equipment preservation. We go to what do we do to keep the business running, and those things actually are just as important in the restoration of business functions as all of the other pieces of where do we relocate, what are our workarounds, what technology backups do we have. If we don't have people and we don't have the initial incident taken care of, it really doesn't matter about the restoration of the business. And from a business continuity perspective, that's really emergency management. But within our realms of business continuity, we think it's real important that we're at least addressing that, even if it isn't in your specific realm of responsibility. So, in the end, it's all about our people. Without people, we really don't have businesses, unless it's a company that's purely automated, which typically is not the case. Questions? Thoughts? All right. So Now, when we're thinking about our overall strategies and our plans, I just kind of throw this up, to really, are we really looking at the right thing, right? And given that we've just had some hurricanes, we've had some clients who've been, dealing with hurricanes, we almost have the two sides of it, right? Here we have the disaster recovery side, which is all the technology. Are we ready to go? Do we know the servers? Do we know the skills? Do we do that there? And then our other individual who's coming in and thinking about taking care of people, right? And so either side, not to worry, we've got our hurricane disaster, preparedness. And my question to you is there anything within your organizations and your plans that are similar to this, that it's kind of one or the other, and we're not meshing the two together? So a couple of examples as we get into some areas. So kind of from a business continuity perspective, right? The strategy is we're going to work from home. And I would say the vast majority of organizations that we have today at least have some form of work from home strategy in case of a business continuity type of event. The technology is in place. VPN is there. People have laptops. They actually even do some testing. That people will work at home occasionally. And we've actually seen this. In fact, I was at a client where we were talking to them about their work from home strategy, and like, it's absolutely perfect. We test this on, a weekly and a monthly basis. We rotate people who go home and they work from home. We have times when we have weather events and the majority of our staff is working from home. We're absolutely covered. And they had a perfect policy, perfect. They had a very good policy, well-defined, expectations. Great. So we're like, check, check, check. But then when we looked at it in more detail, we're walking around and most, at least half of the laptops are sitting on people's desks. Well, everything that was put in place worked, except there was an execution problem, right? There was a discipline issue. It didn't matter how good the program was, and even that it technically was viable. It was that if there had been an event and people couldn't get it back in the building, half of the people didn't have laptops. And when our question was, well, what would you do to get people laptops? Well, we have, a store of 10 that we could get to people, and I guess we'd go buy some. They really didn't even have a thought around that. So great strategy, technically viable, all looked really good on paper until you started looking at the detail, right? The actual execution of the people. And in the end, that's the functional piece of it. Second example. This is an ITDR, and I kind of like this cartoon in that because I've had clients come up and they're like, "Can we just pull the plug?" And this is like their first exercise where they've just implemented something. It's like, hold on, we have a little bit more that we need to do before we're there. We have a few questions that we need to make sure we do before we just pull the plug. Right? But as you can kind of see here, right? Everybody, we think we have a good strategy in place, right? Everything is being assured that everything has been tested and the technology is actually in place. But when we start looking at it in more detail, right, only the larger applications that might have 10 application servers, only 2 of the application servers are being replicated to the DR site. Plenty to do testing, but not enough to actually support the organization as a whole in a real DR, right? We've actually had cases where because it was testing based, it was not all of the production servers are actually being replicated over because they weren't part of the test. And so there are actually production applications that weren't available. So basic functionality was there, but pieces that do all of the integration, because it wasn't completely tested, they weren't needed for the test. So they weren't included in the recovery strategy. So kind of that idea of testing versus productionized, and making sure that you're productionized versus just testing related, because you're checking a box. So again, the strategy was spot on, no issues. They were using the right technology. They had all the right processes. The processes worked, and they could show the functional capability of the application, but they couldn't do an actual productive load test. And there wasn't going to be enough capacity if the entire organization was there. Documentation. This is for me as an IT guy. This is sometimes the hardest thing to get done. And when I look at organizations, I'm really mostly concerned about the previous things, right? What's the functional capability as opposed to you have it down on paper? Because without the functional capability, the paper really doesn't mean anything. But in the end, we need that documentation, and because there are folks that may not have the knowledge in their head, or more importantly, the tasks and actions that need to be taken are not part of that day to day, and so they're not well remembered or well understood. And so you need that documentation for those exceptional tasks and making sure that you catch everything, the things that we're talking about here. And and of course, and we've seen this. Unfortunately, this is the perfect example where a joke is actually based on the truth, right? Where I've got a plan, but it's sitting on a hard drive, or it's actually sitting on a file share, and those aren't highly available, and they're part of actually the recovery task. But obviously, plans are needed to recover, and so if they're not in a place that they're available at the event time, they're really not usable and they don't exist. So again, the plans might be really good, but if they're not going to be available when you need them, that's a really a big miss from kind of, again, a detail. All of the work's gone into it, but now we can't use it. So again, and sometimes the plans are more audit based versus execution based. And so when you pull them up, the first 15 pages are all the purpose behind it and why we're doing it. And here's the overall strategy. And here's, which again, important. But when I had those types of documents, when I was executing this at one of my the companies I worked for, we would typically rip off the first 10 pages and we'd get down to what we needed. So it starts missing the point of what the documents are for. So making sure that the documents are, the purpose of the document is understood and developed in that fashion can also be very helpful. So, but for this specific example is making sure that your documents are in a place that they can be put, as well as making sure that the information in them is pertinent to the recovery and not just pertinent to auditing or, the program management in and of itself. Any questions, any comments, anything that might be hitting home or something more specific as I get into some more details here that might be helpful around those examples? All right. So let me just. Catherine, can I get the controls back, please? Okay. Another area that we like to really think about that sometimes is not considered, and that has to do with people. We really kind of focus on the execution path, what needs to be done, as opposed to really looking at it from a staffing perspective. So as you're looking at some of these details in your plans and in your planning, look at the people. And so think about limited resources. Often when we talk to folks, they're like, it's not going to be a problem because everybody is spread out throughout the country. Great, wonderful. However, if that is the case, what if there were single points of failure? Are there key staff that have very specific knowledge that if they're not there, there is a potential issue of actually being able to recover because they have that one piece of knowledge or they are the expert. We're seeing more and more with organizations that with lean staff that you really don't have true backup. There's general backup, but if it came down to some real technical knowledge or business process knowledge, we wait until that person comes back and it's on hold. If that was the case during an event, that could be very problematic because if they're not going to be back for weeks or they're gone, that just isn't there. So understanding that is really important because that may change some of the documentation that you have, some of the procedures and processes, as opposed to just assuming that, even if that person's on vacation, we'll pull them back. We've seen cases where storms and things have caused, well, it hasn't caused an issue with the organization, it has caused an issue with people being available because they were having to take care of their property, even though it was outside of the issue with the business and the location in and of itself. Right? Do you really understand the critical and time sensitivity of the team and the staff needs? Are there certain people or there certain groups that really need to be available sooner rather than later? The BIA, if you're leveraging your BIA information, that will be there. But you may need to get down into even more detail of not just these teams need to be up in 4 hours or 12 hours. It might be the order in which those teams need to come up. And that's the same thing for applications. So the actual recovery priority is defined. Otherwise, you might have somebody sitting because that dependency isn't there. Do you understand that minimal amount of staffing? Because we think in terms of people will be available, or we only need 3. Is that really true? Right? We used to be in that, when we were relocating people, what do? We just need 3 people for the first 4 hours. Is that really true anymore? And that's becoming less and less something that is possible. And you can see some of the other things here, right? Some of the things that we do see are, dependency issues. Right? Are there people that have dependency issues that they might have to deal with in certain types of events? And this is where you kind of have to look at event specific. If you have something where there's an individual that may be a primary caregiver for maybe somebody with special needs or has higher needs, are they just going to leave because their family needs outweigh their business needs? And if you know about those things, great. Or thinking in terms of relocation types of efforts, are there people with mobility issues that have not been addressed and they happen to sit on the 4th floor, or your alternate site isn't ADA compatible and you have somebody with those types of needs, or customers that need to come in. Again, those details that you kind of think in terms of until it happens, then you're scrambling, right? One of the big things I would like to call out here is the remote work location. More and more organizations, they have in their plan, identify a location if needed. And they know, well, there's four hotels within a mile distance. But rather than taking the time to do that at event time, just spend the time and identify it up front. Even if you don't have a contract, at least our primary is going to be the Marriott, down the street. The secondary is going to be this office space that we have a relationship with a company with, just so that you know where it's at, and also making sure that you've looked at it and there isn't an overlap with staffing. That's a couple of examples we've had with clients where they had defined it, but it turned out everybody was going, not everybody, 90% of the organization was going to one location because they hadn't done that verification of who's going where. Everybody was just assumed we could go to that building because it has so many rooms. But when you start doing the details of what rooms they were going to go to, there wasn't enough space. And this is probably something you're well aware of, but again, insurance. This may not be your responsibility, but we're seeing more and more that this is less of an issue, but really something to be considered about. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but making sure, especially if it is something that you are responsible for, at least from a review perspective, do we have all the appropriate levels of insurance? And do we know what those reporting notification requirements are, or are we relying on people's knowledge? Because that could be one that can be very easily missed, especially if you're using secondary people in the event. Having that in the plans can be very important. So there's a big note that says, you have to notify in X amount of time. Or as I found out with a client very recently, that the insurance or some of their providers are there. You can reach out to them and just state, I'm looking for advice here. I'm not calling out a specific event. And then they put on a different hat and they're looking at it as an assistance perspective rather than as, executing an insurance claim or something to that effect. But making sure all of those things are in case. And are they at the right level? If they haven't been reviewed ongoing, they may not be there. Again, that's probably more on the risk side, but something from the business continuity that sometimes needs to be asked, because it's easy to forget that and just assume that it's always in place because we've done it in the past. So other areas that we really like to make sure that we're concerned about is third party and the vendor side. So a lot of times now, especially as we're turning over services, as we do SaaS solutions, right, where we have applications in the cloud, or our vendors are responsible for providing that service or function, it's their problem. And that's true that they need to be available. But because they're providing that service for you, you really want to make sure you understand what are the dependencies. what is going on out there? Is your reputational risk linked to theirs? From a global perspective, where are their risks? If they're dependent on a global supplier, and if that goes away, you're going to be severely impacted. Understanding that may change the plans that you have, and in your plans, do you have workarounds in place? Can you rely without them? Are you comfortable that they have the appropriate protections in place? And if not, what are you going to do about them? Because just kind of turning it, it's kind of turning over sometimes the keys of major functions to someone else that you have no control over. And in an event that impacts them and doesn't impact you, is that part of your planning? Or are you just worried about what happens to me and I know my vendor will always be available? And the increase in globalization really is broadening that impact to where an impact in Europe or an impact in the southeastern part of the United States can have an impact, to companies that are in the Northwest or in the Southwest. So looking at that can be very, very important. And again, we've seen that where, organizations, and I think a great example of that most recently in the news was the HR provider and the payroll provider that just went out of business all of a sudden. Well, now these organizations are scrambling to figure out what are they going to do about payroll, because the assumption was, well, they'll always be available. And not every organization had plans in place because of that vendor issue. It wasn't their business continuity, it was business continuity for them, but they were fine. So that's a big area to consider. So it's kind of within that third party and vendor side, I'd like to also specifically talk about supply chain. Sometimes the supply chain is impacted by vendors, but you then want to look at it specifically at the supply chain. Have you addressed in your business continuity plans, the various areas of, like we said, key dependency on suppliers? Is there any consolidation that you've done? So now you're, instead of having multiple areas within your supply chain, maybe multiple mini distribution centers throughout the country, you've consolidated down to where you're now 2 or 3, and just one going down now impacts 50% of your organization. And have those tasks and processes been addressed and part of your plan? Or is it just, again, it's assumed, well, we have the other 2 and we're fine, but it turns out that one supply chain location handles 90% of a certain product or good. And we see that in organizations where, for example, we've got some manufacturing facilities that are highly dependent on raw materials and component parts coming from just one manufacturing site for the entire organization. And if that goes down, the whole organization is down. Now, that may just be a risk that you have to take, and so you're building up the resiliency in that one facility. But then that's something that is looked at from a business continuity perspective, again, as opposed to just assuming that it can be farmed out to vendors or moved to other locations. It turned out the solution wasn't coming up with a continuity plan. It had to be resilient. That was the continuity plan. So looking at it again, kind of from a what's missing because of the nail concept, because that one component that, and it wasn't the same component for, different organizations. It might have been one component for manufacturing site B and a different component for manufacturing site C, but they were all coming out of the one. And if that goes down, now you've got, 2 other locations having a problem. So thinking about your overall supply chain and have those been addressed, and lead times, and do you have other vendors that can handle it? And going beyond just, we have another, one of our suppliers can pick up the slack that we're doing, but what are the dependencies for that? Are there certain dies? Are there certain casts? Are there certain plans that they need to have that it's not going to be there? Or it turns out that it's going to take them 3 weeks to ramp up, and the thought was, well, but now we only have a week of supply, and it's going to take them 3 weeks to ramp up. Those are the type of things that often are not into plans that need to be addressed. So kind of out of these things, what else do you want to look at, right? Is we really can, like looking at the areas that look good, but dig into them and try to find the gap. Ask those questions. Don't just look at it superficially and say, it looks good overall, or necessarily trust that the person responsible is like, we're good. Try to get in and dig in. Find somebody that has that detailed knowledge and dig into it. This is kind of where coming up with maybe difficult or somewhat out of the ordinary scenarios will help determine if it works. You know, look at how functional you actually are, as opposed to just saying, have we done all of the steps? Right? That's really back to looking at the areas that are good but might have gaps. Test and really test end to end, even if it's just a tabletop. Make sure that you're starting at the beginning and going to the end, and including, starting maybe with a manufacturing site and saying we've now lost that product because of a hurricane or a fire. What does that then do all the way along the chain? Even within other business processes, whether that's back end processes that are more electronic transaction oriented, such as finance type of transactions, but starting at the order and going all the way to payment or going all the way to delivery. What does that do? More integration type of testing, both from a tabletop perspective as from a technology perspective. Again, that concept of ITDR, where organizations didn't have the middleware pieces completely set up. They had just enough to do some basic testing, but when it came down to it and we did other integration testing, it wasn't in place and it didn't work. And the assumption was, well, we'll just get it up at some point. But the timing of it was, we can get it up in a week, but it turned out that the dependent processes needed to be available in a couple of days. So that disconnect of timing, even though the strategy would work, was a potential problem. Really look at, given the third party part that we talked about, and the various distribution of potentially of organizational functions, is make sure that you're looking at remote locations in whatever testing that you're doing. Do some integration testing with alternate locations that have dependencies, or with third-party vendors. Include them in your testing. Ask, hey, will you participate in this tabletop with us, because we know that it's going to potentially impact you, or we want you to be impacted, and we want to see how we're doing if you can't be available in a certain amount of time, right? Just not from a data center, or just not from the headquarters perspective. Really look at ad hoc type of testing. We just did a somewhat surprise exercise for an organization this week, and it was really very clear. One of the individuals, the secondary person for one of the leadership team, had to step in and didn't know where he was supposed to go, what documents he needed. He was just kind of, and he looked at me, because I was kind of there to observe from an IT perspective, and he was like, do you know what's going on? Nobody briefed me on this exercise. And I said, well, that's a good note. I'm going to take that down. So you don't know where to go, what to do, and what your role is as the backup. That's a problem. Now, would he have figured it out? I'm sure he would have, but it would have taken time, and there could have been decisions that needed to be made because he was on route or trying to call people, or because of the event, he couldn't get through to people because they're actually working the event and wondering where he is. So, that ad hoc testing really kind of demonstrates some of the gaps that you have when you spend time preparing. Everything seems to go pretty well, and then you find some gaps. But when you don't prepare or you don't plan the exercise, you can really see where your gaps are. So we really encourage that. And then lastly, really using all the levels of the staff. And I know this is probably obvious, but we see more and more that the secondary folks, or even the tertiary folks, might participate, but that primary person is there and always jumping in and helping. We suggest get them out. Just have the alternate individuals do everything, and don't have somebody there watching over them. Now, if they start to falter, then you may pull that person in so that you can go through, but at least you'll identify some of those procedural gaps. And they're the best ones that will identify really what's missing in those details that may not appear to be needed, but that secondary and tertiary person are looking at it going, I don't know what to do with this instruction. And the person that developed the documentation of the process, it was just kind of understood. And I like to use the analogy back when I taught math in college when I was in grad school, right? You could go from step one, I'd go from step one to step two. And then the students would go like, we don't follow that. I'm so, well, no, it's really pretty straightforward. 5 steps later, right, we got to the step that I immediately went through because I had been doing this for so long. It's really the same thing in our preparation and our level of detail. Any questions on this? That's really all we wanted to go through. It's really, hopefully giving you some ideas of things that you can go take back in your organization and then start looking at some of the details. Hopefully some of these items gave you some thoughts around what may be missing in your preparations and your planning around documentation, around processes, around execution steps, assumptions that are being made that may not be valid. Those are really the things we encourage you to go back and look at. Any questions? Anything specific any other specific that you'd like me to try to answer, or if not, you can pull this down and hopefully it'll give you something to think about. But we appreciate you taking the time to be with us today. Hope that everything is going well for your program, and that as you're going into the end of the year, you're able to do an evaluation and see where maybe some of your gaps or needs are. And if you have any questions at all, feel free to reach out. You've got my contact information here. I am more than happy to answer questions, and that's just what we'll do, right? That's no obligation, no expectation. You want to jump on and say, hey, I've got a few questions. You mind if we take 15 minutes? Happy to do that across anything that you might have. There isn't anything else. Thank you so much.
Thank you.